Welcome to The Explainer. So, we are staring down the barrel of a massive economic collision, and it is unfolding right in front of us as we head into 2026. On one side, you've got this limitless, exponential expansion of the digital AI economy. And on the other, the very real, very hard constraints of the physical world. I'm so glad you're here because honestly, understanding how these two massive forces interact, that's the absolute key to grasping the global macro environment today.
Morgan Stanley's global chief economist, Seth Carpenter, recently captured this tension just perfectly. He said, oil, AI, and the consumer now sit at the center of our global economic outlook. It's such a striking thought. We're living in this unique moment where the boundless, almost magical potential of technology is constantly running face-first into the gritty realities of physical resources and global supply chains.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1, the exponential AI boom. Breaking human benchmarks.
To understand where we're going, we have to see how fast AI is closing the gap on human intelligence, because this is the engine driving everything else we're going to talk about. Look at the MLIU. This is a massive benchmark test covering 57 diverse subjects. From science to history, the average human scores about 34.5%. But an AI model like GPT-4, it hits 86%. It is easily beating the average human and very rapidly approaching that 89.8% mark of a hypothetical human expert. AI just isn't a novelty anymore, right? It's practically an expert system across dozens of fields, all at the exact same time.
But you really have to ask, how did we get there? Well, it's through an almost incomprehensible amount of math, fueled by the petaflop. If you aren't familiar, a petaflop is a unit representing 10 to the 15th power floating point operations. It's massive. Over the last decade, we have seen this continuous exponential increase in the petaflops used to train these AI systems. That raw computational power is what's driving these leaps in capability. But here's the catch. Generating that kind of computational power, it definitely isn't free.
Which brings us to Section 2, trillions fueling the machine, the CapEx explosion.
To see how this builds into the broader economic picture, we really have to look at the absolute wall of money funding this expansion. Just a year ago, Morgan Stanley projected that the combined capital expenditure for the biggest tech hyperscalers would sit right around $450 billion for the years 2026 and 2027. Now, $450 billion is already a massive number, and it established a huge baseline of expected corporate spending. But get this. That number has already been heavily revised, $1.16 trillion. Yes, trillion with a T. That is Morgan Stanley's new estimate for 2027 CapEx alone. It is a shocking acceleration. The money pouring into AI has practically tripled in their forecasts, marking literally one of the biggest spending cycles in the history of the global economy.
So the absolutely crucial point here is, where exactly is that trillion-dollar investment actually flowing? Well, it's pouring into a massive physical infrastructure boom. We're talking data centers, power systems, specialized chips, and advanced networks. We tend to think of AI as this invisible thing just floating up there in the digital cloud, but the cloud requires the physical earth. To work, it literally requires concrete, copper, silicon, and steel.
And that brings us to the ultimate vulnerability of this entire booming digital economy. What happens if the power simply runs out? Think about it. You can have all the software brilliance in the world, the smartest models ever built, but if you don't have the electricity or the physical chips to run it, the boom stops dead in its tracks. Let's look closer at that in Section 3, Hardware and Grid Bottlenecks, the Physical Limits of AI. Now, what's really interesting about this is the severe geographic fragility in the global hardware supply chain right now. Look at this concentration. Over 90% of logic chip production is concentrated in just 5 places: the USA, Taiwan, China, South Korea, and Japan. If any geopolitical event disrupts this highly concentrated physical supply network, it basically dictates the direction and evolution of AI technologies worldwide. It's a massive bottleneck. Furthermore, actually building the chips is really only half the battle here. As the World Economic Forum concisely points out, if electricity and data are the new oil, grid connectivity is the strategic bottleneck. It's like a giant puzzle. Connecting these massive, power-hungry data centers to power grids that are already heavily strained is a critical roadblock. We are essentially in a frantic race to solve this AI power bottleneck before it stalls the whole thing.
Moving on to Section 4, the looming energy shock, the 2026 macro test.
You see, the stability of our power grid relies entirely on global energy markets, and right now,
those markets are facing immediate geopolitical risks. Listen to this warning from Seth Carpenter because it's vital. He says, we could shift from a price shock to a volume shock, physical shortages and supply chain disruptions. This is absolutely crucial to understand. Higher prices slow economic activity down, sure, but actual physical shortages, they stop it completely. If the current geopolitical situation in the Middle East persists and shipping doesn't normalize, it spells a very real threat to global growth.
To put that into perspective, if the conflict escalates, specifically involving the Strait of Hormuz, Morgan Stanley outlines a worst-case scenario where oil prices surge through $150 a barrel. Remember, higher oil effectively acts like a giant tax on both consumers and businesses. It generates unusually high uncertainty, it boosts inflation, and it weighs heavily, heavily on the broader economy. So let's break down how an energy shock of that magnitude would actually impact global markets, because the exposure differs sharply across regions. China, surprisingly, actually has low exposure here because they've built up these substantial stockpiles of oil. The U.S. sits somewhere in the middle. They are a net exporter of petroleum products, but consumers are definitely still going to feel the pinch at the gas pump. Europe, however, is highly exposed. They are a net importer, and energy prices pass through much, much more quickly into household bills, business costs, and overall inflation. Which takes us to our final part, Section 5, constructive, not complacent, the financial takeaway. Looking ahead, 2026 presents this really distinct dual nature. On the constructive side, the macro and micro fundamentals are actively supporting risk assets. U.S. growth is holding up beautifully, supported by a massive 23% expected earnings growth in 2026, which is largely driven by that staggering AI capex we explored earlier. But we absolutely cannot be complacent. Building that infrastructure means companies are borrowing heavily, and that puts real pressure on credit markets with massive new bond issuance. And, of course, those looming energy shocks we just discussed threaten to derail the momentum at literally any moment.
So, how do we navigate this incredible tension? Well, Morgan Stanley outlines a pretty clear strategy. They suggest an overweight position in equities, especially in the U.S., where earnings look strong and the risk-reward ratio is just far better. They recommend an underweight position in core fixed income, and ultimately they set an S&P 500 target of 8,300 by mid-2027. The cycle hasn't run out of road yet, not by a long shot, but it is undoubtedly getting bumpier, narrower, and far more energy sensitive.
So I'll leave you with this thought. As AI completely redefines our world, will our physical infrastructure be able to fuel the future? Or will these physical bottlenecks break the boom? It really is the defining economic question of 2026. Keep tracking the story, definitely keep your eyes on those physical supply chains, and thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. See you next time.